I am super excited to be here, and we have just started the program today, you all. We are just getting started. My name is Natalie Madeira Cofield, and I am the founder of Walker's Legacy. Very proud to establish an organization that is determined to ensure that we see equitable access to opportunities in entrepreneurship and beyond for all women. And our focus is on multicultural women, and we are so overdue for our time to celebrate Latina entrepreneurs. And this is a summit that we are extremely proud to host. You all have heard from some personal friends, some professional friends, and anyone that knows me knows that working with me means that you've become a personal friend. So we are excited to be here with you all. And I want to kind of just move into kind of dovetailing off of what Mark just mentioned. The reason why this summit is important is because Latina entrepreneurs are important. And one of the things at Walker's Legacy that we do is, one, we run accelerator programs for multiple months, 3 months, called Prospectus, which we are very excited to have our current Latina cohort led by Blanca Garcia, who you have already heard from. We also are extremely excited to produce the type of research that is necessary to ensure that we have advocacy on all fronts and that people are aware of where their communities stand so that they can take this to their neighborhoods and to their communities. With that being said, what I'd like to do now is share with you all some of the research that Walker's Legacy has put together, designed to help educate and empower Latinas around the important information necessary to, one, understand, two, feel inspired, and three, feel empowered by. And we'll start first with our Latinx Women Entrepreneur Research, and then move from this into our equal pay day research, which also is important because we believe that fundamentally, as women entrepreneurs, our first form of disposable income is coming to us through the ability for us to save. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll start the presentation. So as Mark mentioned, nearly half of all Latinx owned companies are owned by women, which is extremely important because it demonstrates the magnitude, not only of interest, but also of capabilities and of demand that exists for multicultural women as it relates to Latina women entrepreneurs. We'll move on to next slide and say that for Latinx women-owned businesses, entrepreneurship grew by nearly 180% over the last 10 years. And from there, we'll also go on to our next slide to say that it was estimated that there were nearly 1.9 million Latinx women businesses in the United States in 2016, employing 550,000 workers and generating, this is important, $97 billion in revenue. This is important because it shows that Latinx women businesses are critical to the entire U.S. economy. And if Latinx women business owners were able to have wage parity, moving to the next slide, we would demonstrate that we would be able to increase these jobs and increase employment by 80,000 jobs and $155 billion. Moving on. The number of Latinx women entrepreneurs grew at a faster rate than any other group. And in fact, that number is 137% between 2007 and 2016. The United States Census Bureau has projected that the number of Latina women to enter would be nearly double by 2050, and for Latinx people to become the #1 minority group in the United States. The growth rate in the number of Latinx women-owned businesses is expected to continue to surge, which makes it an important community to focus on, one, because it's an important community. Two, because it's important for government agencies to understand the vital needs that Latina entrepreneurs have. And three, because it's important for corporations to put funding behind and support initiatives that are designed to encourage, uplift, inspire, and support Latina entrepreneurs. While Latinx women's share of the population is nearly 8.3%, their share of businesses is roughly 5.3%. So again, when we talk about this piece around parity, one, we'd love to see this number be at par. So we'd like to see 8.3% represented by 8.3%. But it's good to know that it's not that far off. Again, talking about the first slide that we showed, which was that nearly half of all Hispanic or Latino owned businesses are started by a woman, is an important measure of this particular fact. Thank you so much. Moving on to the next slide. And, you know, looking at this, it's important for us to understand that Latinx women-owned businesses are significantly smaller. So while we're seeing astronomical growth in the terms of the number of businesses that are being created, which shows the appetite and the need, there still is a lot to be done as it relates to access to capital and access to opportunities that allow these businesses to be able to scale and grow. On average, Latinx women-owned businesses generated about $54,000 in revenue per year, which is compared to white males at $171,000. I'm sorry, white women, which is $171,000, and white males, which is $716,000. So I'll say that again. For Latino-owned businesses, the average revenue is $54,000 in comparison to white women, which is $171,000, and white men, which is $716,000 in average revenue for their business. So more work is to be done around access to capital, access to contracts, and access to markets. Next slide. A study found that for many women, entrepreneurship runs in the family. More than half of the Latinx women who were surveyed said that they had a family member who owned their own businesses. And one of the things that we've just seen historically with communities that have large immigrant populations is businesses are being formed both by necessity and also by experience. For communities that need them and need them most. There is a demand that exists for products, services, and offerings that are culturally competent, and who better to fill that demand than members of their own community. And this is exemplified by the high entrepreneurship rates that Latinx women experience. Moving on. Employers represented nearly 5% of Latinx women-owned firms. And so an employer firm is a company that actually is employing individuals on a full-time basis. Now, we all know that businesses can have contractors and other organizations that they work with, thereby continuing to invest into the ecosystem and into the economy, which is also an important data point that more research needs to and could be done around. But many times the data figure that's used as a benchmark metric is the percent of employees or the percent of employer firms. And in this instance, that is 5% for Latinx women, while employer firms that are non-Latinx women owned represent 12% for women, particularly white women, and white men-owned firms were 5 times more likely to be employers than Latinx women-owned firms. We don't share this information to provide a negative connotation, because I think sometimes as women of color, our communities hear a lot about how we're not at the same par or with the same resources or same access. These are just important economic data and metric items to share and to shed light on where inequalities exist and how we can go about addressing them by, again, equitable access to capital and resources. Next slide. If revenues generated by Latinx women-owned businesses were matched to those currently generated by other women-owned businesses, they could add, as we had previously stated, $155 billion in revenue to the U.S. economy and 80,000 new jobs. And when we're talking about where we are right now, where we have seen record amounts of unemployment, it becomes even more important for us to understand why it should be important for us to ensure that resources are made available to all communities. And with this type of data, people can go to their local Congress members, they can go to their local council members, they can go to their local governments and corporations and say, doing right by our community is doing right by all communities. It's doing right by our global economy, and that is important. Next slide. The most common sources of funding for Latinx businesses were personal funds, such as savings and loans from family and friends. But this is why we're also going to go into the wage parity inequality that exists for Latina women who are working, or Latinas that are working in the US workforce. Because when you don't have access to wage parity, that inherently means that you don't have access to equitable amounts of disposable income that you would be able to do what with? Invest in your businesses. And if this is something that is a part of the fabric of a community, which we all know it is, institutionalized wage inequality, then that means that those who are in your peer groups, those who are in your families, also lack access to equitable wages and the type of disposable income needed to aid and assist business growth. So that's why we're also sharing data on equal pay, because to get to entrepreneurial parity, it's important for us also to get to equal pay wage parity as well for all communities. And today, it's important that we champion this agenda for Latinx women. Moving on. According to the Small Business Office, in 2012, there were nearly 325,000 foreign-born Latinx women entrepreneurs in the U.S. Foreign-born Latinx women pursue entrepreneurship at approximately twice the frequency as native-born Hispanic women. So I'm sure for all of our attendees, you may know someone. This could have been this could be you. This could be your grandmother, your mother, your girlfriend. And this goes back to the previous point that I made again about the fact that in communities where you have high rates of immigrant communities, there is a need-based entrepreneurship. There is a community need for products, services, and offerings that are culturally competent. There is oftentimes also a shutting out of the job market and the job economy that begets the need to create a business to ensure the sustainability of your household and your family. And so entrepreneurship for immigrant communities, for first, second, third generation immigrant communities, is not something that's new. As we all know, the United States of America was built by immigrants. It was built by Native people here, and the businesses here are also very much so tied to immigrant communities, and it's important for us to honor that as another driver of the U.S. economy. Moving on to the next slide. Foreign-born Hispanics are more likely than their native-born peers to encounter language barriers or lack the access to networks to help their businesses to scale and grow. So despite the fact that businesses are being created and formed more readily in this particular subset of the group, of the community, it's still a challenge. We're dealing with challenges with language and access to markets. And also those challenges also beget themselves around access to capital and other access to resources, which is why it's important for us to understand what those challenges are and how we can go about addressing them. Moving on to the next slide. In 2016, the unemployment rate amongst Latinx women was 6.3%, compared to 4.3% among non-Latinx women and 4.1% among Asian women. This may explain one of the main reasons that Latinx women entrepreneurs are growing in numbers, but not necessarily in revenue, which goes to my point, and also the number of employees. So you know better, you can do better when you know better. And now that we know better, we need to do better, which means that we all need to be championing this agenda. We all need to be coming together around equality and access. And we all need to be doing what we can do to change both the numbers as it relates to economic entrepreneurship opportunities, as well as employment and economic opportunities as well. Moving on. And so when we look at where Latinx women-owned businesses are concentrated, they're typically concentrated in the following industries, which include other services. That's hair, salons, pet care, and these things represented nearly 22% of all businesses owned in this subset. Healthcare and social assistance, which represented nearly 15%, and then professional, scientific, and technical services, which represents nearly 13%. Moving on. Latinx women are achieving higher education at higher rates than their male counterparts. But Latinx women, like their non-minority peers, also face the gender wage gap when getting a paycheck from someone else. And we'll move on to the next slide. The rapid growth of Latinx-owned firms comes despite a downward trend in the U.S. Latinx population growth rate. That is, that Latinx businesses are growing at an even faster rate than the U.S. Latinx adult population is. So we're in the middle of COVID right now. As they say, no better time than today to grow a business, start a business, or pursue your dreams. Moving on. And now let's talk about where we are with equal pay. So we just talked a little bit about, we can move to the next slide, where Latinas stand as it relates to educational attainment in comparison to their male counterparts. But there still remains a wage gap. And Latina Women's Equal Pay Day, which we were very excited to celebrate at Walker's Legacy, symbolizes how far into the year Latina women must work to earn what white men earn in previous years. And this brings, the need for more attention on what wage parity actually looks like. Moving on. More than 50 years after the passage of the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Latinas typically earn only 55 cents for every dollar earned by white men, non-Hispanic men, and must work nearly 23 months to earn what white men earn in 12 months. I'm going to say that one more time. And must work 23 months, nearly, approximately, basically 23 months to earn what white men earn in 12 months. And so when we talk about how this affects, 1, the economy, 2, households, 3, economic mobility, 4, economic access, 4, entrepreneurship, it goes back to what we previously stated, which is if we don't know where we stand, we can't advocate, we can't empower in the way that we need to, but we also can't say to ourselves, this isn't just because I'm not good enough. This system was built for me to be working an additional, basically 11 months on top of what a white man is working. How am I to get to parity under these circumstances? And how we get there is by being aware, by championing more Latinas in managerial positions, C-level suites, by championing and being aware of what equal pay looks like at firms across this country, and by ensuring that we say that it is required that we have equal pay. This isn't just an option. This is a requirement for you to be an investable business, for you to be a traded business, or for you to be endorsed by a government agency. Moving on. By 2060, 27% of women in the US will be Latina. Moving on. Latina's weekly median earnings are estimated at $621 compared to $835 that non-Hispanic women make. And so again, if we're talking about almost a third of the US population being classified as Latina, we need to do what we need to do as a nation to ensure that we're closing this wage gap because it's good for the economy. And that's the thing that I don't understand, how people who don't champion universal diversity, I don't understand how they don't get that our communities are critical to the comprehensive economy of our country. And when one of us isn't doing well, others of us are not doing well. We're all in this together. And so it's important for us, whether you be Black, you be white, you be Native American or Indigenous, you be Asian, that we are all supporting the advancement of women, period, across the board. That's right. I see this from you, Mark. Juntos y juntos. Next slide, please. Latina women in unions earn 28% more than their non-union counterparts. and moving on from there. That's important also because what we're seeing is, working as a teacher, working for government agencies, working in manufacturing. That's where we're seeing some of this collectivized bargaining around employment and wage being handled. Latina women represent 8.7% of the total U.S. population, which equates to about $27 million in general kind of funds that the community represents. Next slide. Hispanic women are subject to a double pay gap, an ethnic pay gap, and a gender pay gap. So this is really where intersectionality comes into play. So anybody who's ever had a conversation around intersectionality, this is what they're talking about. We don't just get to be women. We're women and we're our communities. And where our communities lie, that's where we lie. And where women lie, that's where we lie. And so women of color typically find themselves at the bottom of so many of these totem poles because we are dealing with the double circumstances. I don't want to call it a double negative because I see it as a double positive, but we're dealing with the duality of what it means for us to be both our ethnicity as well as our gender. Moving on to the next slide, please. The wage gap between Latina workers and white non-Hispanic male workers persists across wage distribution within occupations and among those with the same amount of education. This gap narrows, but not dramatically, when we control for education, years of experience, and location by regression, just adjusting differences between workers. But again, what we're saying is that a Latina can have a master's degree, a white male can have a master's degree, and we're still talking about a wage gap that exists in the same role. Now that is give or take based off different geographical locations and different companies, but at the end of the day, the wage gap persists. Moving on. With the same level of education and experience, on average, Latina workers are paid only 66 cents on the dollar relative to white non-Hispanic men. Moving on. And as Hispanic women increase their educational attainment, their pay gap with white men generally increases. The largest dollar gap, more than $18 an hour, occurs for workers with more than a college degree. So what is this saying? It says what I just mentioned, which is here we are going off, getting education. Here we are going off, getting master's degrees. Here we are going off, getting our doctorates. And yet we find that the gap widens for us. Why is that? We have to do something about that. But that's also, again, why it's important for us to understand where this information is, because at the same time that there is advocacy around ensuring that there are meaningful jobs, because part of the wage gap exists because of the types of jobs that Latinas have access to, women of color have access to. Right? And so if we are relegated to lower wage jobs, then sure, we have a wage gap. But that's not what this slide is saying. This slide is saying to us that even when we are college degreed, even when we're mastered or PhD'd, we still have a significant wage gap. And we need to be on the championing of advocacy side for both of these communities, because we're not a monolith. And at the end of the day, I think it's important that we have people who are championing in this space and giving voice to that community of Latina entrepreneurs and Latina workers, as well as we're championing in this space. And they need to see that all communities they're not the same. They're just not the same. But we can't get people to see that without the data, for whatever reason, even though they see it because they live it and they experience it. Without the data, they will act as though it's meaningless, and as though we are just kind of being sensitive to the subject. Moving on to the next slide. Nearly 1 in 3 Americans are not aware of the pay gap that exists between Latinas and white men. So I say that one more time. Almost a third of the people in this country don't know that there is a pay gap that exists between Latinas and white men. How is this possible? This is why this type of data is important. 1, because we need to know, and 2, because we need to share this type of data with our communities to what? Empower them to speak up and empower them to inform. Because the moment we share with someone where we are, now we can't say unconscious bias. No, you knew because I told you. This is important. We have to empower people by sharing this information and then holding them responsible for making the provisions necessary to adjust for the inequality. But we can't do that if we don't know. So that's what today's purpose is about, letting us know where we stand. Moving on to the next slide. Nearly half of Americans are not aware that a pay gap exists between Latinas and white women. So let's talk about that. I just said a third were not aware that it existed between Latinas and white men. And now I'm saying nearly half don't know that there's a pay gap that exists between Latinas and white women. Again, this goes back to a previous slide that talks about the intersectional nature of what it means to be a woman and a woman of color. And when we're empowered, again, when you know better, you do better. So this is not just an onus of us to tell our, white male counterparts and contemporaries. This is an important set of information for us to share with everybody, including our white female contemporaries and white female counterparts as well. Everybody should know. We should all know where we all stand so that we can all lift and rise together. Moving on to the next slide. For every 100 men who are promoted to manager, only 68 Latinas are promoted. This is a broken rung, results in more Latinas getting stuck in entry-level jobs. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Today, more than half of Latina women are the breadwinners, shouldering the cost of caring for their families. So why does equal pay matter? Because equal pay allows our families to have equal access to the American dream. That's why equal pay matters. Equal pay matters because the American dream is either us having equitable access to economic mobility or equitable access to entrepreneurship and living out the pursuit of happiness. So this is why this is important. And with nearly half of Latina women being primary breadwinners in their households, to do right by Latinas is to do right by our community. Moving on to the next slide. Lower earnings for Latinas means less money for their families, especially since more than half of them are breadwinners. Moving on to the next slide. That's exactly what we're saying. This impacts families' abilities to buy groceries, pay childcare, invest in children's education, and more. All of this. Moving on to the next slide. Despite the vast underpayment and related challenges, we already know this. I don't need to say this. Because everybody who's on today knows this and should be feeling powered up and revved up and excited. Again, this data is meant to motivate, okay? And it's meant to tell us what we need to do, what we could and should be doing more of. Latinas are one of the most important consumer groups in our country. In 2013, Latinas made up 86% of spending decisions in their respective households. That's important. Again, if I spend my dollar with you, you need to invest in our community. That's to me the new economic golden rule. If I spend, you spend. Moving on. As of 2016, the Latinx community yielded nearly $1.4 trillion in buying power. Imagine the impact on the US economy if the spending and consumers' power of Latina workers was doubled. We would be able to buy more homes, make more purchases, pay more in taxes, and help bolster the overall health of our country. Moving on. If paid fairly, the average Latina would earn over 1.1 million more over the course of her career. So everybody on this line would be a millionaire because we would all have earned more than $1 million in wages that were due to us, that we didn't receive due to us being women of color. Moving on. And if paid fairly, the average Latina could on average afford more than 2 years of extra rent. This is important, more than 2 years of extra rent. This is how it costs us to be us. It costs us to be us. It's expensive to be a woman of color, but we persevere. Moving on. Latinas play a prominent role in Latino-owned businesses. We mentioned this. We talked about nearly 87% of growth between 2007 and 2012. We can move on to the next slide. And closing the wage gap would add more than $26,000 to the annual salary of Latinas, and it would cover all the things that we talked about. 3.7 years of groceries, 3 additional years of childcare, 18 additional months of mortgage and utility payments, and the full cost of tuition and fees at a 2-year community college. Moving on. No one is more powerful than the Latina consumer, voter, as we have seen with this recent election, or businesswoman, and that absolutely Latinas are unstoppable when they know their value. Moving on. Thank you all so much. So listen, I can't hear you all in the crowd or in the audience, but I'm just going to assume that this data touched, moved, and inspired you in a meaningful way. Let's make sure we make today count. Let's hear from some amazing rock star bosses who are going to share with us their firsthand experience in not only understanding these statistics, but excelling and achieving despite them. Their stories should invigorate you to move forward and to use this weekend to write down another one of your dreams and another one of your goals, and to go out into next week accomplishing it. Because at the end of the day, folks, this has been one hell of a year. 2020 has really done something to all of us. But let's make sure that at the end of the day, when 2020 closes, that we look back and we say to ourselves and we say to our families that we did everything we could do to position ourselves and them for prosperity. Because now, with the internet being here, you can be at home, you can be here, you can be there. The information is readily available. And now it's about what are we going to do with it. And with that being said, I'm happy to pass the baton and introduce our fireside chat speakers, Beatriz Acevedo, the co-founder of Suma Wealth, who will be joined by Sandra Garcia, of the New York Times.